This is Congressman Danny Davis, and of course, it's on a Friday, not just any kind of Friday. As a matter of fact, it is Good Friday. I always say that every Friday is a good day, but this is Good Friday. You know, the blues singers said they call it Stormy Monday. Tuesday's just as bad. Wednesday's a little worse, and Thursday is oh so sad. But the eagle flies on a Friday, and Saturday I go out to play. Sunday I go to church and kneel down on my knees and pray. Well, this weekend is Resurrection Weekend. Those of us who are of the Christian faith and believe in Christianity, this is a very holy period for us. It is holy because it is the resurrection period. And much of what Christianity is based on is the birth, the death, and resurrection of Jesus the Christ. And to many of us, that really means that you can go down as far as you can go, but you can then rise to the highest of heights. And that must be a good way to live. That's a good way to feel. That's a good way of be. So let me welcome you to this Friday evening version of what we call listening to the people. But we also talk to the people, and the people can talk to us. And that's the option that cable access gives to us. And sometimes I wonder why more people don't use it, why more people are not engaged with it, because it gives you an opportunity to express yourself, to listen, to learn, to share, to give, to motivate, stimulate, activate, be engaged, be involved. Just as this resurrection, this death, and this rising was a very important political season in the biblical days, in biblical times. It's also a very political season right now. It is political in that everything that we do when two people don't agree, I say some politicking goes on. And if two people agree all of the time, then I also suggest that one of them is unnecessary and that you don't necessarily try and just be. You try and reach agreement. You try and reach accord. You can be distanced a long way, but it's so much better when you can close the gap and you get closer and closer and closer to each other. And that brings about a feeling of warmth, a feeling of mutuality. It's a feeling that you can give. I call it giving warm warm fuzzies rather than cold pricklies. You can either give a warm fuzzy or you can give a cold prickly. And of course, warm fuzzies are warm and fuzzy and soft. Cold pricklies are just the opposite. They are cold and prickly, and they're not so pleasant to put your hand on a cold prickly. I'd much rather put my hand on a warm fuzzy. So let's talk a little bit. We just had a primary election in the state of Illinois, and it looks as though there were some winners and some losers. And of course, I want to thank the people who voted for me, so that at the end of this session, I will then still have 2 years to try and accomplish a great deal. Obviously, I want to see other people who think like me become the ones who get elected. As much money as there was spent, the voter turnout was terrible in much of the state, and especially in areas where African Americans live. I don't know why it is that people did not feel the necessity to vote. I mean, just thousands and thousands of people did not vote. As much as we talk about democracy, as much as we talk about democratic principles, as much as we talk about individual responsibility, that it is not only the right, but it's also the responsibility. To be an American carries with it both rights and responsibilities. And I hear people complain, and they talk about how bad things are and how things aren't going to change and the changes that need to take place. And when I ask them, who did they vote for? They look at me like I've lost my mind. Vote? Why was I going to do that? I said, why were you going to vote? You determine who gets put into office, who can make those decisions that you want to have made. Certainly you understand that you can't exist in a world with no laws, no rules, no regulations, a world of chaos, a world where individuals just kind of do whatever it is that they decide to do. Just imagine what it would be like driving down Roosevelt Road with no traffic signals, nothing to tell you when to stop, nothing to say when to go, nothing to say how fast you could go or how slowly you could drive. If there were no rules and regulations, then it would be chaos. But that's not only in terms of driving an automobile. If there were no rules and regulations relative to how we live, how our society exists, where do we get the money from to keep law and order? Where do we get the money from to hire policemen? Where do we get the money from to pay doctors and nurses and other people in hospitals? Well, it's pretty obvious that somebody have to make those decisions. And we are the ones who are charged with decision making. I sometimes say that there are two kinds of people in the world. There are those who shape and make society. Then there are those who are shaped and made by society. There are those who shape and mold. And then there are those who are shaped and molded. So wouldn't you rather be a shaper and a molder than to be a moldee? Wouldn't you like to rather be one who helps decide what your living arrangements are going to be, as opposed to making those decisions for yourself? Suppose you didn't have the right to choose a mate. Somebody else would choose that mate for you. Suppose you didn't have a right to decide where you went to school or what kind of school you attended. Or suppose there was no school there for you, or there was no grocery store for you. Then how would you survive? If there were no jobs for you, how would you make it? So why not be a part of helping to make those decisions, as opposed to being contented with whatever it is that somebody else will decide? So I am perplexed when I look at the records and I see how many people who did not vote. If we have a voting turnout of less than 50%, it means that less than half the people did not participate. Is something gone wrong with our concept of democracy? Is there something wrong with this idea that we hold these truths to be self-evident? That all men, women, and children are created equal and endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, the rights for life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. How do you guarantee that if you do not vote? How do you guarantee that you can change things? If you don't like something, change it. If you don't like the way somebody else is doing it, then take over from them and do it yourself. And so this notion that a change is going to come, it will, if we bring it. I remember one preacher who, when he preaches, he often says that he will bring things, and he's talking about Jesus the Christ. Reverend Mac McCullum, who is sort of semi-retired now, but retired. And Mac would often, during his sermons, reinforce the idea that change is coming. And he would be really saying that Jesus will change things. Sam Cooke had this very popular song that says he was born by the river in a little tent. And just like that river, he's been trying to change things. It may be a long time coming, but I know that change will come. If we won't change, then we have to work to make it happen. We have to, all of us are born not equal in the sense of things that you may have, but you're equal in terms of breath, the ability to breathe, the ability to grow if you get the proper nourishment, ability to survive. I need you. You need me. We need each other if we are to survive. Somehow or another, I am hoping that we can get the point across. And yeah, I know that all men and women were not created equal in this land of ours. They were some lofty sounding words put on paper. They didn't even mean all men. They didn't mean all Caucasian men. They meant men that they felt had enough ability and understanding to make public decisions. So they meant men who could read, write, and own land and own things and talked a certain way. And those were the men. They certainly did not mean African American men, because African American men who were enslaved at the time were only counted or were counted as only 3/5 of a person for the purposes of representation in the House of Representation or the House of Representatives or in Congress where I serve every day. They had a compromise, a great big compromise, as they was trying to figure out how to set up the government. They called the one compromise how they would give each state representation in the Senate. And they said, notwithstanding the population, notwithstanding how big your Senate, your state is, you have 2 people to vote. And so every state that was going to be a state would have 2 people voting in the Senate. We still have that. We have some states that are not half the size of other states, but each state gets 2 representatives in the Senate. They are called senators. That's called the Great Compromise. Then when they figured out how many representatives there would be, that would be according to how much population you had. And the slave-owning states wanted to count the slaves. The non-slave-owning states said that won't be fair. We're not going to count the slaves. They're not citizens, they're slaves. They're not people, they're slaves. We're not going to count them. But then they had something called the 3/5 Compromise. They agreed that those states where people were enslaved, they would count the enslaved individuals as 3/5 of a person. So that means that my ancestors were only counted as 3/5 of a person for the purposes of determining representation in the House. And of course, they weren't talking about women, because women didn't get the right to vote until about 100 years ago, a little more than 100 years ago, 1919. The Constitution and all of that stuff took place in 1776. But women struggled and advocated and advanced and pushed hard and lobbied and did everything that they needed to do, and finally got the right to vote. So the real deal is that, as Frederick Douglass would say, struggle, struggle, strife, and pain are the prerequisites for change. And if there is no struggle, there is no progress. We celebrate Women's History Month. And oh, I have had the good fortune to know and work with and work alongside so many strong, outstanding women in the communities where I have lived, that it's like magical to think of what they did. Some of those women I have been fortunate to name post offices after. As a matter of fact, the big post office downtown, I named it after my predecessor. It is named the Cardis Collins Post Office. Post office at Western and Monroe used to be called the Midwest Post Office, but I named it one of the most powerful women that I've ever known. It's named the Nancy B. Jefferson Post Office. Nancy Jefferson was head of the Midwest Community Council for many, many years until she got sick and passed away. I named the post office on West Madison Street, down past Pulaski in that area, the Mary Alice Mo Henry Post Office. Mary Alice Mo Henry was a community activist who helped establish Bethany Hospital as a place where African Americans could go and get health care. She worked at the hospital and she put a tree out there in the lobby. They needed to raise some money, and she raised over $10,000 on a tree called a money tree. Just a money tree. That was matching money to start a clinic. And of course, it was wonderful, wonderful, wonderful. There are others of those that we could name and talk about, but I want to end really about Resurrection Sunday. I'm not a minister. I'm not a preacher. But I enjoy knowing about and being a part of the Christian faith. And so resurrection kind of means that you can be down, but you can get up. It even meant that Jesus the Christ was killed, and stayed down 3 whole days. And yet he got up. And I guess the essence of that is you can be down, way down, but you can get up. So I urge you to get up on Resurrection Sunday. Get up from whatever difficulties that you're having. Get up in terms of changing your mind, having it become new and refreshed. And if you feel like it, go to one of those places and share with others as we experience Resurrection Sunday. Have a good Friday and an even greater Resurrection Sunday. It's been a pleasure sharing these 25 minutes with you. Have a wonderful evening and a better tomorrow. See you next week.